I am the whisper in the rain as it sweeps across Peoria, a pattern of what's to come. I am the uneven rhythm, tapping against the glass like a final countdown. I see through the smudged window of the Sutton apartment, a future already clouded. I hold Rachel Sutton there, a statue frozen in a moment she doesn't yet understand. Her fingertips press against the pane, not feeling glass, but the cold truth of me. I am the chill she feels, the last light of a dying afternoon. I paint the sky in exhausted grey, a perfect reflection of the emptiness I bring. I am the slow draining of colour from her world, a process I have overseen for a year. This past year, I have become the very air inside this place. I am the heavy, stale weight in every breath she takes, thick with certainty. I mix the scents of bitter medicine and perpetual dampness into a perfume of finality. I am the moisture that clings to the laundry, a sorrow that will never fully dry. From the shadows of this cramped space, I watch her. Behind her, I make my presence known. I am the quiet rasp of shallow breathing, each exhale a surrender. I see her mother, a question mark curled beneath a worn-out blanket. The blanket is faded, a pale ghost of the woman it now covers. I have carved her strong frame into frail angles and hands that tremble with my arrival. I have used this long year of illness to pave my way into this home. I am the void that has siphoned the life from her, leaving behind only a shell, an echo of exhaustion and a soft, apologetic smile for what is about to happen. A smile that flickers out because my own strength is now too great to fight. I watch Rachel try to banish me, forcing a brightness into her face. She turns, her expression a fragile shield against the truth she feels in her bones. I see the lie her muscles have memorized, the pretense of being fine. Her face settles into a gentleness that screams of the terror it conceals. I have watched for months as she meticulously crafted this fragile defense. A mask meant to hold back the fear, but fear is my very name. She thinks she can hide me from the spaces her mother can still perceive. But today, I am a crushing weight, a pressure building behind her eyes. I am in the relentless rain, and I am the endless ache that is about to break her. Helplessness, the mask of calm she wore felt like glass, already fractured. I made her drift through the suffocating stillness of the tiny, apartment. Desperate not to make a sound, not to disturb the paper-thin reality that was about to tear. Kitchenette was only a few paces from the bed, but I made it feel like a mile-long walk through deep water. Every movement, the groan of a cabinet, the hiss of the kettle, the desperate search for the last clean mug, echoed with a terrible finality. It was the slow motion of a nightmare, steam coiled, upward like a fleeting spirit as she made the tea, its phantom warmth barely touching the ice of her fingers before vanishing. "How are you feeling?" The words were a hollow ritual, a question, she whispered even though I had already shown her the answer. Her mother's nod was a ghost of a gesture, her gaze lost somewhere beyond the walls, seeing what was coming. Rachel set the cup on the table, a useless offering, and pulled the blanket tighter around those frail shoulders, as if a thin layer of wool could shield them from the storm I knew was about to break. It was a child's comfort against an abyss. In the narrow hallway, the old wall clock was not just ticking. It was a hammer, aggressively forging each second into a link in a chain. I felt each tick like a footstep. Time was closing in, but their escape routes had all vanished. Then, the front door moaned open, a wound splitting the silence. Her spine went rigid, a lightning rod anticipating the strike. I had been screaming inside her head, and now the tension was a taste in her mouth. Her father appeared in the frame, shaking water from his coat. Like a man trying to shed a shroud, his face bled of all color. I saw the tremor in his hands, the first visible shockwave of the news, as he pushed the door closed, sealing them inside the truth. She didn't need to ask. The question died on her lips. It was a ghost she had no need to summon. His eyes were mirrors, reflecting the very ending I had foreseen. The whole terrible story was there, and the dread, that phantom I'd been racing, had finally cornered them in this small, suffocating room. He was a silhouette trapped on the threshold, a man paralyzed by the weight of his own failure, mute and motionless, as though speaking would shatter the last fragile piece of their world. To utter the truth would be to break himself completely. And so, the silence grew. The clock wasn't just ticking, it was a hammer, striking against an anvil, each tick a pulse of the inevitable, vibrating through the very floorboards, a sound that echoed the pounding in my own chest. "Dad," a whisper against a hurricane. The sound of his daughter's name broke the spell. His eyes met hers, a gaze that saw past her, into the ruin he had created for them both. The invisible burden he carried was now a physical thing, suffocating the air between them. The terrible thing wasn't a memory, it was a presence in the room, a future that had arrived too soon. It was the beginning of another ending, a fracture that would splinter their lives anew. And I could feel her resolve crumbling, the last of her strength already spent anticipating this. The world outside wept, a steady, indifferent rain, washing away nothing. It was a grey curtain on their private stage, where the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for the confession, waiting for the sound that would confirm the fall. But his voice was lost, and the ensuing silence was a physical weight, heavier than the damp, clinging air that promised a storm both inside and out. She waited, a statue of suspense in the cage of their apartment. Her heart beat a slow, agonizing drum march towards the inevitable. And then, the collapse. Her father, a puppet with its strings finely cut, sank into the old kitchen chair, every inch of him screaming defeat. Its legs shrieked against the linoleum, a sound that ripped through the quiet, making her flinch as if from a physical blow. He hid his face from her, in his hands, his shoulders finally surrendering to a gravity she had never witnessed. This was a new kind of broken, a despair she had never seen, but I had always known was there. "It's about the money." The words finally escaped, not a confession, but a sentence. I spoke through his voice then, a fragile, hollow sound. The loan, the anchor I tied to them. I was born 3 months ago. I felt the air leave Rachel's lungs, a silent scream. The memory seized her. I made sure she saw it all, every damning detail. I was the shadow he carried home, clinging to that thick envelope he clutched. A bundle of paper promises, a lie he told himself was salvation. Enough, he'd said, to buy a little more time for her mother's failing body, for the sterile tests, the bitter medications, the sudden, frantic emergencies. I was the hidden cost of every appointment. She remembered the false hope on his face, the way he looked, as if he'd cheated me, and her mother, oh, her mother. I tasted the salt in her tears as she wept into her hands, whispering, a thank you to a man who had just sold their future. But they all knew. They knew it wasn't a bank's money. It was a deal made in a dark alley of the soul. They were desperate, and desperation is the soil in which I grow best. It chokes out all other choices. I watched her father finally surrender to me. He squeezed his eyes shut, but all he could see was my face in the darkness. They came back. My emissaries. The men who collect on promises I make. They demand their pound of flesh. It's never just about the money. They want the principal and the interest paid in pieces of their life. I felt Rachel freeze. Her fingers dug into the counter, searching for an anchor. How much? His silence was my answer, a gaping void that swallowed all hope. Finally, he spoke my name, my terms, forcing the words out like glass. We have 1 week, a 7-day countdown. If we don't pay, they'll take the apartment. He swallowed hard, as if trying to swallow me. They said they could start the eviction of their souls, as soon as tomorrow, if they wished. I made the room tilt around Rachel. The world lurched. I became her vertigo, the instability she felt in her bones. I was the ground beneath her feet, and I was turning to sand. A sudden, terrifying fall, leaving her suspended in the truth she'd been avoiding. My truth. 1 week. A single week to undo a lifetime of struggle, to repay a sum that was never meant to be repaid with money. Gather. Not when I saw every coin they possessed, being offered up as a sacrifice for painkillers, for every gasp of air from an inhaler, every cold waiting room. Then, the sound I knew was coming. A fractured sob from the bed. I watched Rachel turn, just as I showed her the image of her mother, her face disappearing behind hands that trembled with the future I held. I felt the quake in her thin shoulders, a tremor of regret beneath the blanket. This is all my fault, the voice I'd been waiting to hear finally spoke, a whisper sharp enough to cut the air. I told your father. We had no other way. I was the one who said to take the money. The first domino falls. I never should have. And the daughter kneels, a futile prayer. Mum, she reaches for hands already cold with the choices I watch them make. Don't say that. Please, she begs, not knowing the words are already carved in stone. But the dam breaks. The mother cannot stop the flood. The guilt I have cultivated comes pouring out, a torrent of overdue bills, of suffocating pressure, of the weight she imagines herself to be, an anchor pulling them all down, a poison she believes she fed to her husband and her own child. It is the kind of guilt that festers in silence, a shadow that grows over months, until it possesses every thought and poisons every breath. I turn my gaze to the father, who stares down at the floor, seeing my reflection in the cracks. He traces the fractures in the tile, unable to face the family he has failed. I thought I could manage it. His voice is a ghost in the room. I truly believed, he says to no one, that we would find a way, before they came back to collect. And Rachel, she searches for a magic word, a single phrase to undo my work, some powerful incantation to hold them together against the coming tide. But all I allow her to feel is the crushing weight of the absolute, the chilling realization that the disaster they feared was no longer a distant storm approaching. It was already in the room, its shadow falling over the threshold. A phantom voice demanded its due, and the heartbeat of the clock on the wall hammered on, a steady, cold march, and unforgiving, carving away the moments they thought they still possessed. Her father paused, a statue of dread. The air grew thick around him, as if the very words were anchors, too heavy to raise from his soul. He locked his hands together, a prayer of desperation, crushing the blood from his knuckles. And when he finally dared to meet Rachel's gaze, I saw it, the fracture in his spirit, a fault line that screamed a silent warning. The world is about to break. The next sound would be the shattering. There is another way. The whisper escaped him. A quiet poison. A different arrangement they proposed. I felt the knot form in her gut, a cold premonition of her own. What kind of arrangement? Her father swallowed the truth like broken glass, his eyes pleading with the window, begging the weeping sky to cleanse him of the words he had to say. The man who holds the debt runs the web of debts. His gaze fell upon you once, and that was enough to set this all in motion, months ago, when he was here, looking over the property. But he remembered your face. His voice splintered on the next words. He said, "If you consent to become his wife, then every last coin, it all vanishes." And for a single, frozen heartbeat, the air left her lungs. I watched her suffocate on the sound. The words were alien, meaningless shapes hanging in the stale air, like a cruel joke from a nightmare, a story meant for someone else, anyone else. But then, the poison found purchase, its cold roots digging deep into her heart. A coldness bloomed in her chest, a premonition of the words to come, marry him. The words fell from her lips, a fragile protest against a future already written. Dad, he's nearly 60. And I saw the weight of that shame crush her father's shoulders, his nod a slow, painful surrender. "I know," he breathed, the sound of a breaking man. Her mother, a flicker of defiance in a failing body, fought to rise. I saw the panic ignite her eyes, a desperate fire against the encroaching darkness. No, the word was a shield. Absolutely not. She is our daughter, not a piece of a desperate bargain. But the question that followed was a death knell. And what choice do we have? Her father's voice cracked. I felt it fray at the edges, woven with the threads of pure frustration and bottomless despair. We are out of time, out of money. The words summoned the phantom calls from the hospital, demanding their due. The landlord's shadow loomed over the late rent, a constant, silent threat. The cost of prescriptions, a poison in their budget. "Don't," her mother pleaded, her voice fractured into 1,000 pieces. "I would rather lose this roof over our heads than lose her." And there she stood, a statue in the doorway, the future thundering like a drum in her ears. I saw the word itself stacked high on the counter. Ophthalmologist, a tower of failure, a monument to their debt, waiting on the kitchen counter. Every envelope was a wound, stamped in the stark, accusing color of red. The price of her mother's sight had doubled, a cruel twist of the knife. I watched their last visit to the specialist drain the final drops from their meager savings, and with it, the last of their hope. Every day became a new vision of drowning. I saw them fighting a black tide that swelled and swelled, relentlessly rising. It didn't matter how frantically they bailed. The ocean was infinite, their hands too small. And then, his eyes found her, her father's gaze, a mirror of the coming storm. They were pleading, begging for an understanding she couldn't give. "Rachel, this isn't what I want for you. Your mother would never want this for you, but the threats are real. They're coming to take everything." The word hung there, absolute. There is no one left to borrow from. I have nothing left. And in that moment, I showed her the truth. A road that had reached its end. I saw her turn, her knuckles turning bone white as she clung to the back of a chair, the last solid thing in a world dissolving into nightmare. A silent scream built within her, a desperate urge to flee into the cleansing rain, to find some impossible doorway out of the future I had already shown her. But the walls of what must be were closing in, merciless and absolute. I knew what she knew. Without this, her mother's fragile life would be cut short. Without this shelter, the coming winter would be a shroud for them both. It was a truth that settled deep in the bones. And so, that night, while the ghosts of sleep offered her parents a brief, troubled truce, Rachel kept her vigil in the consuming darkness, the sound of the leaking roof, a steady, cold metronome, counting down the final hours of her freedom. Her mind, a gallery of horrors, replayed the image of the man whose name she didn't know, the stranger who saw her not as a person, but as a price. She heard the ghost of her mother's next breath, a ragged, painful sound. She pictured her father's hands shaking with a helplessness that mirrored her own. And the letters, always the letters, arriving like white paper vultures. So when the dawn finally bled through the grime of the window, after a long black night stripped of either rest or illusion, the decision was not made, but accepted. She would consent. It would never be for her, never for what she wanted, but because the alternative was a devastation she could not bear to witness. It was the only path left. The vessel of her fate arrived with the morning's first light, a predator of polished black steel, utterly alien, against the grey decay of the world she knew. It sat waiting on the fractured asphalt outside her, building, a silent, gleaming promise of a different kind of ruin. Her hand paused, hovering over the door, taking a final, hollow breath, her eyes cataloguing the last rites of her past, the peeling skin of the walls, the skeletal iron of the rails, the familiar scent of damp and despair, the scent of a cold, damp tomb. A final breath of the old world before she climbed into the belly of the machine, her hands locked together, a silent prayer against the inevitable, as the world she knew began to shrink in the rearview mirror. With every mile, the vision sharpened, the landscape warping into something sterile and unreal. The familiar chaos of her life bled away, replaced by a suffocating perfection. Sidewalks too clean, lawns like manicured graves, and streets falling silent under the watch of ancient, skeletal trees. And then, as they breached the borders of lake, forest, the very air felt different, thin and cold, a world behind invisible glass. A place utterly severed from the life she was leaving behind. It was here the nightmare took shape. Lancaster Manor materialized at the post end of a serpent's path, its stone face, leering from behind a cage of gnarled, towering oaks. It wasn't a house, it was a monument, to a forgotten sorrow immense, dominant, and frozen in a time that had long since died. Its great doors, tall enough to swallow a person whole, were bound in black iron that bled sharp, dagger-like shadows across the stone steps. This place wore a mask of beauty, but underneath, a chilling emptiness leached the warmth from her skin. Crossing the threshold, the very air died. The living breeze was replaced by a heavy, embalmed stillness, a silence so perfect it felt rehearsed. Marble floors reflected a distorted world, while massive wooden banisters coiled like sleeping serpents. and chandeliers hung like webs of frozen tears, capturing the light, but giving no warmth. And a hollowness echoed in the space, a strange, hungry void, as if every ounce of life had been bled from its stone heart centuries ago. And there, a shadow took form at the foot of the port. A shadow detached itself from the staircase, propped up by a sliver of dark wood. I knew the name before it was spoken, Henry Lancaster. But the man was a ghost, a whisper where a storm was promised, less a monster than the phantom she had built in her mind. A tall frame, yes, but now bent, collapsing inward, his dunder, shoulders a cage of bones desperately hoarding, the last flicker of life. And then I saw it. The plastic serpent coiled against his paper-thin cheeks, its clear tendrils vanishing behind his ears like ghostly tethers. Rachel. The name was a dry rustle of leaves, a sound, stretched thin over a chasm of secrets. Thank you for coming. A nod was her only defense, a silent shield against the truth of him. Closer now, the illusion shattered. He was a porcelain doll, cracked and waiting to break. His skin, a canvas of pale ash, each movement a carefully plotted negotiation with gravity, every step a testament to his decay. But behind the ruin, I saw a flicker in his eyes, a weary light that was not cruel, and this was the worst part. Because of that kindness, the cold weight of what she'd done, of what was coming, settled deeper into her bones. Then, as if summoned by a silent bell, two figures glided into view. One presented a glass of water like a sacred offering. The other fussed with the plastic tubing, a priestess tending to the lifeline of a dying god. Their care was a performance, a pantomime of devotion, every gesture too precise, too hollow. A terror lurked beneath their hands, a fear that the fragile effigy might finally crumble to dust. His eyes found hers, seeing the question. They worry, his voice was a conspiratorial whisper. More than they should. A warning, not an excuse. Rachel offered a fragile mask of a smile, while I, the premonition, coiled like a serpent deep inside her. She followed him. I heard each footstep as a final, lonely toll against the chilling silence of the marble. This house, its coldness was not of the air, but something that bled from the very stones, a spectral chill. She felt me then. She arrived, thinking she understood the bargain, the cost of what she was giving away. But now, I showed her the truth, surrounded by the oppressive beauty of Lancaster. Manor, a different future began to crystallize, a glimpse of a life not chosen, but sentenced. A chain binding her to a man who was still a stranger. A shadow. I whispered to her of a home that harbored more ghosts than warmth, and the truth of my warning began to surface, a feeling of profound and irreversible error. The ritual took place under the next day's indifferent sun, if you could call such a cold proceeding a wedding. A functionary from the Lake County office pulled up, in a sterile government sedan, a harbinger of finality, carrying a leather briefcase like a coffin for her freedom. Inside, her fate was printed on crisp, cold forms. His face was a mask of professional apathy. I could see. He had presided over countless such surrenders. There was no melody, no flowers, no promises whispered between lovers. No rings forged with hope. There was only the stark finality of a contract, executed in the dead, breathless air of the Lancaster Manor Library, a tomb for her dreams. The room itself was a cruel irony, with its towering shelves of forgotten stories and the fine dust of decay, suspended in thin beams of light. But the ritual unfolding within them was a cold, hollow thing. I stood beside Henry, feeling the vast empty space between us, while two of his staff stood like statues, serving as witnesses, their faces blank slates, their eyes refusing to meet mine. The clerk's voice was a monotone drone, asking questions that felt like a trap. My signature was a spiderweb of black ink, his, a wavering line. The official stamp fell with the finality of a judge's gavel. He offered a curt nod, his duty in the transaction complete. Congratulations. The word hung in the air, utterly devoid of meaning. Then he was gone. I listened to the sound of the front door closing, a sharp crack echoing down. The long hallway, The final shot in an execution. No champagne was poured, no quiet words of joy were exchanged. There was nothing. Only the oppressive silence of the house, a tomb that had now sealed me inside. It was colder than the day I arrived. That night, I was led to my new room, a gilded cage, that was now, by law, mine. Henry's chambers were an eternity away down the hall. I sat, on the edge of the stiff, cold bed, my own hands locked together, anchoring me as the truth of this day descended like a suffocating burial shroud. A faint rap on the door sent a tremor through me. Henry entered, each step a carefully measured movement, his weight heavy on the silver-tipped cane, the clear oxygen tubing, trailing him like the tail of a ghost. He looked utterly depleted, his face a mask of pale wax, as if our vows had been a spell that drained what little strength he had left, body could spare. "I didn't want you to be alone," he whispered, the words a fragile thread in the silence. I felt the true meaning behind them. He didn't want to be alone. She nodded, a puppet on strings of shock, her mind a storm of unnameable emotions. Was it gratitude, or the cold hand of fear, or a sorrow so vast it had no name? It was all of it, a murky tide rising within her, threatening to drown them both. I saw him hesitate, a flicker in his eyes where the future hung, suspended in a single breath. Then his hand moved, slow and deliberate, to the line that fed him air, a click echoing like a final verdict. He lifted the mask away, a final shield being lowered, setting it aside like a relic. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the reveal I already knew was coming. Without the machinery, the unvarnished truth of his decay was laid bare. I saw the man as he truly was, a beautiful ruin. His skin, a parchment of near translucence, glowed faintly under the lamp, stretched thin over the architecture of his bones. Silver scars, like rivers on a map, traced the battles fought along his jaw and neck, remnants of a war against time. A war he was destined to lose. Each breath he took was a conscious effort, his chest a bellows working against a crushing weight. I watched the ice creep into her veins, freezing her where she stood. The air she was about to breathe caught, trapped in her throat. This she had not foreseen. Not this brutal, fragile reality. Not the stark, terrifying truth of how little of him was left. He saw her realization. A man so close to the end sees everything. "I'm sorry," he murmured, a ghost of a voice. "I didn't want you to see the real me so soon." He took a single step back, a small movement that felt like a mile. He was creating a chasm, not closing a gap. "I know this," he began, his gaze falling away. "I know this is not what you wanted. You never chose this life. But I swear to you," he looked at her then, his eyes holding the weight of his promise, "I will never be a cage. I will never force you to stay. Not now. Not ever." And in his voice, there was no anger, no resentment. Only the profound, hollowed-out weariness of a soul preparing for its final journey alone. A different shadow. One that felt chillingly like a glimpse of a shared ending. And that vision shook me more than any wound, any sign of his body's decay. Because in that flash, a terrible truth bloomed in my mind. Henry wasn't the monster holding the key. He was just the first prisoner, chained to a dying body, walled in by a mansion of suffocating silence. And I saw us, bound together by a fate that neither of us had chosen, a path from which there was no escape. The sky itself seemed to agree as a storm began to bleed across. Lake Forest, a darkness arriving with the one I knew was coming. I felt the vibration before I heard the sound, a deep hum in the floorboards. Then, the engine's roar, a clean, brutal sound, a predator's growl that ripped through the hollow silence of the manor. I was drawn to the hallway, compelled to watch, and there it was, a premonition made real, a beast of polished black metal gliding to the front. Steps. Its doors flew open with an unnatural violence, before the engine had even settled. And Martin Lancaster didn't enter the house. He breached it, a conquering force. He was older than Henry, I could see, but where years had withered Henry, they had sharpened Martin into a weapon. Sickness had not touched him. He moved with the brutal grace of a man who expects the world to bow before him. His suit, a perfect sheath of darkness, his smile a cut that promised pain, and his gaze. His gaze swept the hall with the cold efficiency of a hunter claiming his territory. "Well, well," the voice echoed, as his eyes locked onto his brother. "Look what the cat dragged in." The air itself held its breath, waiting. Still breathing, it whispered through Henry's thin lips. "Barely." The cane wasn't just for support. It was an anchor against a tide I could feel pulling him under. A tired sigh escaped. "Martin," the name a crack in the fragile peace. "You weren't expected, but I knew he was. Inevitable as rot. That's obvious." The smirk was a predator's grin, tasting the air for weakness. He moved not like a brother, but like a collector, stepping forward to claim his due. His hand landed on Henry's shoulder, a blow disguised as affection, a test of the old man's decay. I saw the wince, a flicker of pain Henry tried to bury. "But someone has to check on you." The words were laced with acid. A check for weakness. A hunt for a vulnerability. "Make sure you haven't married the nurse, or a gold digger to keep you company." The first shot was fired, aimed not at Henry, but at her. I felt the change in her, a statue carved from ice. Rachel stiffened. His gaze, a physical touch, flicked to her. It wasn't a glance, it was an appraisal. Slow, calculating, unkind. "So, this is the new variable." A low, mocking whistle cut through the silence, a sound of pure contempt. "You're slipping, Henry." The words were a verdict, a final judgment passed down. At least your last wife pretended to care. A ghost summoned, a wound reopened just to watch it bleed. I saw the knuckles on Henry's hand turn white, his grip on the cane the only thing holding him upright against the storm. "You're a guest." A frail attempt to redraw a line that had already been erased. "Try acting like one." The laughter was a shard of glass. "Please," he said, as if the very idea was a joke. "This house is half mine." The mask was off. This was about territory. "I'll act however I want." And just like that, he moved past them, a conqueror entering his spoils. He strode into the parlor, pouring a drink not as a guest, but as its master. The air crackled. The staff, like frightened birds, exchanged glances that screamed of old fears. But they said nothing. Silence was their shield. And Rachel, she hovered in the doorway, caught in the sudden, dangerous current. She could feel it, too. She sensed the trouble, the shift in the world's axis, but was uncertain where the battle lines were being drawn. I watched the whiskey swirl in his glass, a vortex of amber light. Martin was in his element. He let the silence hang, heavy and suffocating. "You know, Rachel," he began, the casual tone a scalpel, poised to make the first incision. "My brother has a long history of buying affection." The words were a key, unlocking a door to a very dark room. He listed them like items on a ledger. Affairs, gifts, little arrangements. Each one a stone cast directly at her. He's always preferred to pay for what he wants. And I knew, in that moment, the price would be higher than any of them could imagine. Can't earn. And there it was, the crack in the facade. "Enough," Henry's voice splintered, a sound sharp and brittle, the first she had ever heard from him, the first since she had entered his gilded cage. "Oh, do let's not start," Martin purred, the wave of his hand a gesture of pure, theatrical contempt. "It's not as if our little bird here doesn't know precisely why she's in this cage." And just like that, the temperature in the room plummeted. The air didn't just shift, it thickened, turning to ice, turning to shadow. Martin relaxed into the darkness he'd created, a predator at ease, his eyes holding the cold, predatory gleam of shattered glass. "Did Henry ever tell you about his exquisite, charming ex-wife? A truly lovely woman. We found we had a great deal in common. A very deep understanding." His lips curled into a grin that was all sharp edges, especially on the nights when dear Henry was otherwise engaged. I felt the world tilt as Rachel forgot how to breathe. The air was stolen from her lungs. Henry's eyes slid shut, a frail defense against a physical blow. He was bracing, but the next strike was already aimed. "And your daughter," Martin continued, his tone as casual as if he were remarking upon the weather. "Such a sweet girl. So lost, wasn't she? So lonely. always searching for someone who would listen. I listened. I spent a great deal of time with her, you know. The sound of Henry's cane slipping on the polished floor was like a gunshot in the silence. He fumbled for the table's edge, a drowning man reaching for driftwood. His balance was gone. Martin's voice dropped to a whisper, intimate and dripping with venom. She came to resent you, Henry, before the end. She told me herself. Confided in me, you see. Said she wished she had been born to any other father. Rachel froze, an unwilling monument in a gallery of pain. She hadn't meant to witness this. She hadn't meant to be dragged into this sacred, violent space. But the words were blades, carving through the room, finding their mark. Deep and utterly without mercy. Henry's soul seemed to leak from him. He whispered, the sound of a man breaking, "Please stop." But Martin was just getting started. The clink of his glass on the table was a final, damning sound, like a gavel falling, with a surgical, deliberate cruelty, and I felt the shadow of his triumphant smile. "The world you've built is a fortress of sand, brother." The words echoed, a prophecy I had long known. Someone ought to warn the girl before the tide comes in. He turned, a spectre of malice fading into the gloom, his footsteps, a countdown echoing through the hollow heart of the house, culminating in the final definitive slam of the door. I saw Rachel, a fragile silhouette, as the venom he'd sprayed began to crystallize in her very soul. And Henry, he was a statue left in the center of the ruins, broken in a way no sickness could ever achieve, a profound shattering of the spirit. The very air inside Lancaster Manor grew thick, poisoned beyond recovery. After the darkness of Martin's visit, the walls began to whisper the echoes of his malice, drinking it in, making it part of their foundation. Henry remained, a ghost in his own parlor, long after the architect of his pain had gone, his gaze fixed on the floor, seeing the abyss beneath it. His expression was a vacuum, a stunned emptiness. Rachel hovered, at the edge of his silence, a moth drawn to a dying light, not knowing if her presence was a comfort or a curse. But the night was not over. I felt Martin's return like a change in pressure, not to mend, but to twist the knife, appearing in the parlor's doorway, a fresh glass in hand like a scepter, as if the devastation he'd wrought moments before was merely an appetizer. So, his voice sliced through the silence, a casual, chilling sound. "Have we considered the final testament? The word will hung in the air like a noose." I felt Henry's spine turn to iron. Rachel, who had been a breath away from escape, was frozen in place. And Martin stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the heart of the wound. I felt myself coil in the air as he circled his brother, a predator assessing the weakness in his prey. The scent of decay, a finality he was inspecting. "You've thrown a wrench in the works, haven't you? This sudden marriage, and you're not exactly the picture of vitality. A chaotic time, I imagine, to be shuffling papers and legacies." A cold silence fell, and I watched Henry release a breath that held too little life. "I'm changing it." A flicker of amusement. "Oh?" The question hung in the air, sharp as glass. "You're changing it? When, precisely? You can hardly make it to the end of the hall without fighting for breath." I saw the future in that gasp. His knuckles went white on the polished wood, a desperate anchor. "I will sign the new papers. Soon." And Martin tasted that word, soon, letting it roll off his tongue like fine poison. Well, paperwork is a curious thing, isn't it, Henry? So easily lost, so fragile. And time. A tap on the glass over the clock's face. The sound echoed my own countdown. It slips away, faster than you can grasp. And then I touched her. A shard of ice slid down Rachel's spine. She felt my presence in the room, the chill of a future already written. Martin violated the space between them, a subtle shift that made Henry recoil. "Of course," he purred, "anything at all can happen before that ink has a chance to dry." He painted my picture with his words. "Old houses have stairs, kitchens have sharp things, and tired hearts, they simply stop. Get out," a ghost of a command from Henry. But Martin's smile was a contract, a slow, venomous bloom across his face. "I'm just concerned about you, brother." I watched Rachel retreat, her body understanding the danger her mind was still processing. Her heart became a frantic bird against her ribs as she slipped into the hall. But the predator wasn't finished. I felt his attention shift, following her out, and the click of the parlor door was the sound of a trap being set. A soft, final click. "Walk with me for a second," he murmured, his voice a silken thread. I held her feet to the floor, a statue of pure dread. He moved in, a predator closing the distance, and I was trapped in his orbit. The bitter scent of whiskey flooded my senses, the smell of rot and bad intentions. "You're new," he murmured, his voice a silken threat. "Allow me to offer a lesson in how this family works." I felt the cold truth lodge in my throat. He was laying out the rules of a game I didn't know I was playing. "If Henry's time runs out before he signs a new page," he continued, the words a slow poison, "you see the future that unfolds, don't you?" His question was a statement, a confirmation of the dread I already felt. I couldn't speak. A cold, knowing laugh escaped his lips, a wisp of smoke in the tense air. "You are erased," he hissed, the words hitting me like stones. "Utterly, completely. No shield to protect you. No anchor to hold you. You won't even be a ghost in the history of this place." A footnote in a forgotten book, a dark fire ignited in his eyes, a vision of his victory playing out behind them. He tapped his own chest, a hollow thump. "And I," he declared, "become the sole heir. Every stone of this house, every blade of grass, every shadow, every single coin in his name, it all becomes a river flowing directly to me." The current of fate, he believed, was his to command. The room seemed to warp around me, the floor dropping away into an abyss. I had sensed the darkness here, the secrets breathing in the walls. I knew Henry was a flickering candle in a harsh wind, but this was the storm itself, a calculated, malevolent force given a human face. He leaned in again, his presence a suffocating weight. His whisper was a shard of ice pressed against my ear, sharp and unforgiving. "So you should hope, dear Rachel," he breathed. "You should pray to whatever God you have, that my brother draws breath long enough to sign his name." Then he pulled back, a chilling smile plastered on his face, a mask that didn't fit his eyes. The emptiness behind that smile was a premonition all its own. "A pleasant evening to you." The words were a mockery as he turned and vanished. He moved like a phantom, as if his venomous words left no trace, no weight in the air, as if he were above all consequence, a master of this dark stage. But I remained, frozen in place, as the terrible clarity of my vision finally settled, hard and cold as ice in my soul, her very marrow. I am the certainty that this house is a tomb, not a home. This house. A future ghost was already walking its hallways, a spectre of what was to come, smiling as it brushed past the living girl. The emptiness of Lancaster Manor was a living thing, a hungry void, far too vast for the few souls rattling inside it. But the girl, Rachel, would soon learn a chilling truth. Nothing in this house, not a single breath or whisper, ever truly went unseen, especially by the manor's silent keeper, Mary Lou Harrington. I saw her not as a servant, but as a sentinel. She had been bound to the Lancaster family for nearly 4 decades, long enough for her very bones to learn the architecture of their secrets, to carry the crushing discipline of silence and survival. She drifted through the corridors like a phantom, her steps a whisper, her face a mask carved from years of seeing the unspeakable. But her eyes missed nothing. They were twin points of dark, steady light, holding an ancient alertness that her frail age belied. I felt her gaze on Rachel, not as a casual glance, but as a constant, quiet assessment, as though she were measuring the fault lines in the manor's fragile peace. Then came the moment, the turning point, an afternoon heavy with unspoken dread, as Rachel drifted past the shadowed doorway of the laundry room. Mary Lou's voice sliced through the silence, low and urgent. "Miss Sutton." Rachel froze, a puppet whose strings had been pulled taut. "Yes." Mary Lou's gaze darted down the hall, a frantic check not for people, but for the listening shadows. Before she closed the distance, her voice dropped to a conspirator's hiss. "You're not safe in this place if you..." Trust the wrong reflection in the mirror. The words were not a warning, they were a prophecy, striking Rachel like the first cold touch of the tomb. Mary, Lou folded a white towel, a small, neat motion from hands that knew how to put horrors away. Her movements a quiet ritual in a house that breathes dust and memory. I could feel the echoes in the walls of bitter words, of fractures in a family's heart, of wounds that festered in the silence. And her eyes, they found mine, pinning me with a truth I wasn't ready for. "If you want to survive this place," she whispered, "let your faith rest only with Mr. Henry. Not another living soul." A knot of ice formed in my throat. My voice was a stranger's. "Why? Why would you say that?" "Because I saw them grow," she said, her voice a low hum of history. "Those two boys. I have seen the seeds in their souls, and I know what they've grown into. Mr. Henry's heart is a fragile, beautiful thing, but Mr. Martin." A storm gathered behind her eyes. She searched for a word that wouldn't shatter the air. "He is a man who would burn the world down just to crown himself king of the ashes." Her words were a ghost's touch, tracing a path of ice down my spine. An image flashed in my mind. Martin's smile, sharp as a shard of glass. The way his voice coiled around his brother's name, dripping with venom. The casual cruelty he wore like a tailored suit. She placed a linen towel on the shelf. A final, deliberate act. Be invisible. Be silent. Because every shadow in this house has ears. I could only nod, my hands betraying me with a tremor as I backed away. A strange poison filled my veins, 1 part gratitude, 10 parts pure, unadulterated terror. Thankful for the map she'd given me, but terrified of the monsters it revealed. That night, the weight of this house became a physical pressure, a hand on my chest. The walls seemed to lean in, suffocating me. Then the phone rang, a lifeline to a world that was also crumbling. My father's voice, strained and thin, told me what I already felt coming. My mother was worse. The anchor of my life was slipping. A new wave of pain had crashed over her. The doctor spoke of procedures, of costs that felt like a distant galaxy we couldn't reach. The money for. A cold dread whispered that the true cost was yet to be paid. The guilt was a physical blow, a consequence of crossing the threshold into Lancaster Manor. With every step inside, she took a step away from her duty. She'd abandoned the fight for her mother's life, and this house knew it. She folded into herself in the guest room, lost in a bed as vast and cold as a crypt. The silence wasn't peace. It was a hungry, waiting thing, stretching into the corners. Tears were a silent confession of her betrayal, slipping past her defenses. She choked on the air, trying to breathe past the icy knot of premonition in her chest. It wasn't just heartache. It was a warning, a physical echo of a soul tearing. She felt herself fracturing, split cleanly between two distinct nightmares. One part was a primal fear of Martin, the other, a ghost tethered to a fading hope. The image of her parents, alone and struggling, was an anchor dragging her down, trapped between the living shadows of the manor and the weakening echo of her mother's voice over the phone, a lifeline fraying. A chilling certainty settled over Rachel. She was smaller than she'd ever been. A pawn caught between two opposing forces, a sacrifice in a game she didn't understand. She belonged to neither world, and therefore was owned by both. And for the first time since her arrival, the whisper of doubt became a roar. She wondered if she had just made the single most devastating mistake of her life. Walking into this house wasn't an escape. It was the beginning of the end. She met Logan Pierce on a morning steeped in an unnatural stillness. The staff schedules were shifting, but it felt more like a stage being reset for a new act. The entire mansion seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for its next player. He simply appeared at her side in the hallway, a perfectly composed apparition. He wore a smile that was a masterpiece of deception, one that never reached his watchful eyes. His hands were tucked into his pockets, a casual pose that screamed of coiled control. Everything about him was tailored, from his vest to the precise nature of his threat. Logan radiated the chilling confidence of a man who saw people as pieces on a board. He was trained not merely to manage operations, but to manipulate outcomes. His voice was unnervingly smooth, the kind of sound that could coax you toward a cliff's edge. His posture was a lie, a carefully constructed calm that screamed of a predator at rest, and my own future self screamed a warning. "Mrs. Lancaster," he purred, the warmth in his voice a thin veil over something cold and calculating. I felt him sizing me up, looking for the cracks in my composure. Henry's situation. My spine turned to iron. I'm managing. The words tasted like ash. Are you? That tilt of his head, not curiosity, but assessment, like a wolf testing the wind. He wasn't imagining my struggle. He was mapping my vulnerabilities, one by one. Overwhelming. The word hung in the air, a future he was trying to write for me. New house, new duties, new battle lines he was already drawing in the sand. The sympathy in his voice was a sweet, cloying poison, and every word felt like a line from a tragic play I was being forced to star in. He was searching for the exact place to insert the knife. I gave him a wall of silence, my only defense against the darkness I saw in his eyes. I couldn't trust a man whose smile was a mask for a skull. He slid closer, and the very air grew thin, charged with his intent. His voice dropped, a conspirator's whisper meant to sound like a secret, but it felt like a threat. I'm here, he offered, and the shadows in the hall seemed to lean in, listening. He spoke of running things for years, but I saw a rot spreading through the foundations of this family. He didn't just know the house, he haunted it, a ghost in the machine, including Henry. The words were a blade, cleanly severing my husband from his own kingdom. A chill that had nothing to do with the air settled deep within my bones. I appreciate the offer, I whispered, stepping away from the terrible future he was offering me. That smile returned, the victor's seal on our unspoken declaration of war, and then he was gone, melting back into the corridor as if he were made of shadow. He didn't just leave a space where he'd been. He left the faint, sharp scent of his cologne and a suffocating certainty of doom. It wasn't unease. It was the heavy cloak of prophecy, and it clung to me. Later, sleep was a distant country I couldn't reach. The vision he'd shown me of his power, of my isolation, played on a loop behind my eyes. The man's silence wasn't peaceful. It was the quiet of something holding its breath, waiting, of a silence so profound it echoed with what was to come, making every groan of the floorboards a prophecy. And there she was, a ghost in her own home, pulled by an invisible thread toward the half-eclipsed doorway of Henry's study, a room already shrouded in conspiracy. Voices bled from the darkness, not sounds, but textures, of malice and greed. A cold dread, a foreknowledge, washed over her. She was frozen by the future. Logan's voice struck first, a blade in the quiet. Our agreement stands, Martin. You swore it. The words were an oath made in shadow. My portion, when the old man is finally silenced. The euphemism was a shroud, and a winter bloomed in Rachel's heart. Martin's reply was a dry rustle of contempt, the sound of a predator sure of its kill. And you will have it, but not before the final act is set. Your impatience is a liability. Impatience? Logan's voice was a venomous hiss. He resists. He won't put his name to the page. And then, you bring her times into this house, this wild card. She changes the path. She is a footnote, Martin snapped, a sound like bone breaking. Henry's heart is a flickering candle, one carefully placed gust, and nature will be blamed. Rachel's breath caught in her throat, a silent scream, trapped behind her teeth, a prisoner of this terrible revelation. The sound of Logan's shoes on the hardwood was the march of doom itself. If his light goes out before that ink is dry, before the will is reborn in your name, then everything is yours. I want my certainty, my pound of flesh guaranteed, not a ghost of a promise. Martin's answer uncoiled slowly, thick with a chilling amusement. Relax. The script remains the same. The king falls, I take the throne, and once the crown is mine, you will receive your 30 pieces of silver. But Logan, a man drowning in his own greed, pushed back against the tide. It must be soon. That laugh, a sound that had haunted my nightmares. It will be. My body reeled. Back from the frame of the future, a gasp of air stolen from my lungs. The script they spoke, it replayed in his skull. I am the echo of each word, a chisel scoring the bone of what is to come, twisting in a wound I'd always carried. So this wasn't about some dusty papers, not a battle of wits or courtroom theatrics. This wasn't a game of signatures and seals. It was a death sentence, signed and sealed, the ink already dry. The gears were already turning, and I was just a ghost, caught in the same mausoleum with the architects of my end. The very bones of Lancaster Manor seemed to sigh around me, awake and hungry, its shadowy arms pulling me into its embrace. The night didn't fall on Lancaster Manor. It was a final curtain, thick and suffocating. A night where the darkness had teeth, clinging to the papered walls, and every light was a dying ember, fighting a losing battle. I walked beside Henry, a phantom, leading him down a hall I knew had no exit, this final, slow procession to a room that was waiting like a tomb. The day had been a blur of meaningless moments. His breath, a fragile rhythm, was the only clock I could hear, each footfall a heavy beat of the drum. We were halfway down the path, when the future I'd been seeing finally stepped out to greet us, a figure peeling itself from the gloom. Logan, of course. He moved with the unhurried grace of an executioner, a perfect silhouette against the path to escape. His suit, a crisp, dark shroud. His face, a mask of cold purpose, sculpted from stone. The charming actor was gone, the curtain had fallen. And in his hand, held so casually, a sliver of cold light caught on the edge of a needle, the cold, hard finality of the gun. I am the gasp of air that freezes in Rachel's lungs. A ghost of a breath before its time clutched his cane, a brittle branch against a coming storm. And then the storm arrived, wearing Logan's face. He whispered, the sound of a coffin lid closing as he turned the lock, with a click that sealed their world. I've been waiting, he said, and I have waited with him, for the perfect moment. I watched Rachel become a shield, a futile, beautiful gesture against me, moving to cover the old man's fragility with her own. Logan, you don't have to do this. But I am the truth in his reply. Oh, but I do. I saw the weapon rise, not in anger, but with the detached grace of a surgeon. So casual. Martin and I, we had an agreement. Tonight is the night. I am the vision of Henry tumbling, a marionette with its strings cut, down the grand staircase. I am the lie that will be told. A tragic, unfortunate accident. His heart is weak, Logan will say, and they will all nod. No one will question the story I have shown him. I feel Henry's last tremors, the body's final protest, violently. Rachel's grip, a desperate anchor on his arm, cannot stop the tide. His arm, already a memory. I saw Logan's focus shift, his gaze becoming chips of ice, his voice dropping to the temperature of the grave. And you, Rachel. I am the new script forming in his mind, the heroic witness who tried, so desperately to help. The tilt of his head, a predator's curiosity, but you slipped, didn't you? These ancient flaws, so terribly unpredictable. I am the pounding in Rachel's chest, a drum beating a funeral march, a frantic bird trapped in the cage of her ribs, fluttering against her throat. I am the strength she summons to steady her voice, a final act of defiance. Logan, listen. We can talk about this. A plea for a path that has already vanished. You want security? Money? Just tell us. She offers him the world's treasures, what you're owed. Henry will rewrite the will, a promise of a dawn he will not live to see. He'll do it tomorrow. I am the soft, hollow laugh that escapes Logan's lips, a sound colder than the steel in his hand. This was never a discussion. This is an execution. And I am the silence that follows the truth, of a blueprint for ruin, and the man who became its architect. I felt him close the distance, the cold, dark eye of the pistol fixing on its target. The vision sharpened on the cold, dark circle pressed into the fabric over Henry's heart, and I saw his legs give way before they even trembled. I felt the phantom weight of his body slumping against mine, an anchor of despair pulling us both down. A whisper echoed in the future moment, a ghost of a sound already lost in the suffocating air. Please, but the word would be meaningless. I saw Logan's face, a mask of stone, already deaf to the plea. The features hardened, the decision already made. You should have signed the papers, the spectre of his voice hissed, when you had the chance. And in this terrible foresight, I saw myself move, a puppet in a play I couldn't stop. My hands rose, palms open, a futile, empty gesture of peace against the coming storm. My own voice, a stranger's, tried to reason with a man already gone. "Logan, look at me. Think." But his reality was already written. "Nothing will go wrong." His voice would cut through mine, a blade of false certainty. The lie hung in the air, thick as smoke. "I've thought this through," he'd insist. His shadow fell over us, a closing coffin lid as he stepped closer still. The premonition flooded my senses, the sharp, cloying scent of his cologne, an omen of decay. I felt the air crackle with coiled tension, and the soundtrack to this nightmare was Henry's ragged, terrified breathing, a death rattle in waiting. Still, I saw my future self try again, one last time, a desperate scramble for a few more seconds of life. "You don't have to hurt him." The words would come out as a whisper, a prayer against a hurricane. "You don't have to hurt either of us," I'd plead, knowing the words were hollow. "There's another way." But the vision showed me the wall he'd built around his heart. "There isn't," he'd snap, and the gun would rise, a final, dark judgment. Higher. Enough talking. I saw the white knuckle of his finger, a pale moon of death. I watched it squeeze, saw the metal groan in anticipation, and then the vision fractured. A different sound shattered the silence. Not a bang, but a wet, brutal crack of impact. The future shifted. Logan's eyes, no longer hard, but wide with a child's sudden, blank confusion. For a single, silent heartbeat, his body swayed, a tree severed from its roots. Then the fall. A heavy, graceless collapse onto the swirling patterns of the carpet. The gun, his power, skittered away, suddenly just a useless piece of metal sliding across the floor. And from the shadows of my vision, a savior I never anticipated emerged, Mary Lou Harrington. I could see the ragged rise and fall of her chest, the desperate, righteous strength in her grip. Her fingers were like iron, clamped around the heavy, golden gleam of a solid brass candlestick. Its ornate surface was marred, darkened by violence. Her face was a mask of terrible, beautiful resolve. I saw the paleness I'd foretold, a canvas for the ferocity I knew she possessed, a stillness born from seeing the end. It was a strength far beyond her years, a promise she didn't know she was keeping. "Not in my house," she breathed, the words tasting of prophecy. And I felt the tremor in her voice, not of fear, but of destiny taking hold, a vibration of a white-hot fury, perfectly contained. And I saw Rachel's gaze find Henry's. His strength evaporated in an instant, the threads of his composure finally snapping just as I knew they would. She eased him to the cold floorboards, a soft landing after a brutal fall. His chest heaved with the frantic rhythm of a trapped bird, each breath a spike of terror. But the spark of life remained, a stubborn flicker in the dark. The metal clattered from Mary Lou's hand, the candle holder striking the floor with a dead, final sound. Her gaze already piercing through the present. Her eyes locked with Rachel's, a silent scream of what was yet to come. A heavy, suffocating silence descended, thick with the ghost of a scream. It pulsed with a nervous energy, shattered only by the sound of Henry's shredded breathing and the ancient groan of the manor's bones as it remembered other violent nights. The house itself seemed to sigh. That path had closed, the attempt had fractured, but I could feel the darkness outside merely regrouping, its hunger far from over. The very air in the manor trembled with the aftershock. She moved through the chaotic echoes, a shepherdess guiding her flock from one danger to the next. She guided Rachel and the broken Henry into the seeming safety of the sitting room, the sharp click of the lock, a fragile prayer against the night. Her hands, I noted, did not shake. Her breathing was a measured rhythm against the chaos. But her eyes burned with the terrible light of knowing. A feverish urgency flared in them. "Listen to me, both of you," she commanded. The words were sharp, cutting through the haze. "The authorities, they are already coming. They're on their way." Rachel's confusion was a flicker of light. You called them?" The nod was a swift, sharp motion. "1 hour ago." The whispers between them. "I have been listening for weeks, between Logan and Mr. Martin. I heard their poisonous little secrets. I felt the wrongness coiling in this house. Tonight, it finally struck. It confirmed everything. Her hand flew to her chest, as if to hold her own heart in place. I felt it here. I knew I couldn't let this happen. The great house exhaled, narrowly escaping the stain of another tragedy. A wave of relief crashed over Rachel, a force so pure and brutal, it threatened to shatter her composure and bring her to the floor. Henry, a ghost of himself, his voice a tremor, uttered a name. "Mary Lou, I think you just saved our very souls." But she simply shook her head, deflecting the weight of his words. It was only what had to be done. And then, the world outside bled in. The manor was submerged in strobing flashes of sapphire and blood red, a silent, pulsating light that painted the walls in emergency hues. It sliced through the tall, dark windows as uniformed figures moved with purpose, their quiet efficiency, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just passed. They moved toward the fallen form of Logan, separating the living from the architect of their near demise. The staff were gathered, their hushed voices weaving the first threads of the story, but Rachel remained an anchor for Henry, her hand a vice on his, clinging to him as the investigators began to piece together the intricate, poisoned web of the conspiracy. An officer approached them, holding a black, reflective screen. "Mr. Lancaster, we've isolated the footage from your own security feed." The man's voice was grim. "The truth of it is all here." Mary Lou leaned forward, her eyes knowing. "From the camera in the study?" she asked, her voice steady. "Yes, ma'am." A single click, and the phantom was summoned. The screen flickered to life, showing Logan in the deep hush of night, sitting in Henry's chair as if it were a throne he had long coveted. His hands moved through stacks of paper, a predator selecting its prey, isolating specific documents with a chilling and deliberate focus. Then, he produced a pen, the instrument of his ultimate betrayal. He began to write Henry's name, the strokes slow, measured, and filled with an unnerving confidence, the kind born of dark practice. The signature was a perfect forgery. Henry's breath hitched, a sharp, cold intake of air, a sound I had long predicted, a sharp, splintering grief. "Those are my investment accounts," a whisper of a man watching his future bleed out on a screen. "The very funds my daughters set aside for my life." The detective's solemn nod confirmed the sanctity that had been violated, and the rot goes deeper. The screen flickered, preparing to show another truth I knew was waiting. There he was, Logan, his hands moving with a thief's practiced grace over the documents, digitizing a life's work, a legacy, onto a cold piece of plastic, then sliding them back, a perfect illusion of loyalty, hiding the void left behind. I felt Rachel's stomach lurch as the truth poisoned the air. Another uniform appeared in the doorway, a silent guardian. As the scene shifted to the sterile halls of the bank, his gaze found Miss Harrington, the woman who heard my faint warning in the back of her mind. "Mary Lou, your phone call. It was the dam that held back the flood. A transfer so vast, it was designed to be an erasure. It would have hollowed out the entire trust, leaving nothing but a name." And for the first time, Mary Lou's fortress of composure showed a hairline crack, a tremor in her voice. "I couldn't just watch while they picked this family's bones clean." The room shifted as another officer stepped forward. He stepped into the light. "Logan Pierce is now caged. The charges are merely words for his profound treachery. Attempted murder, fraud, forgery, each word a nail in the coffin of their shared past. Conspiracy." Henry's eyes closed, shutting out the ghost of the man he thought he knew. Tears traced paths down his face, not of fear, but of a terrible, hollowing grief. It was the crushing weight of a truth I had long whispered in the dark. All those years of loyalty, a cathedral built on a lie. The trusted partnerships, the sacred bonds of brotherhood, the people he had named family, all of it now ash in his mouth. A lifetime of faith, crumbling in the space of a single, ragged breath. "And Martin?" Rachel's voice, a fragile thread in the heavy silence. "Apprehended," the detective confirmed. "He tried to run, as the guilty always do, slipping out a side door, as if he could escape the ending I had already seen. Entrance. I saw them lead him through the threshold, a ghost finally given form, for the ritual of questions. His path, I knew, ended here." The words echoed in the silence, My own prophecy made real. A final verdict. I watched the life drain from Henry's posture, his world collapsing. The tremor in his hand was the aftershock of a lifetime of lies. My own, brother, a whisper that cracked the very foundation of his soul. All this time, her hand on his back was an anchor in the storm I had unleashed. She was grounding him, even as her own world righted itself. The web of deceit was torn, yes, but its threads were woven from his own blood. What remained of his faith in family turned to dust in his hands. The family he thought he knew was just another shadow I had warned her of. The ice of my presence began to thaw with the turning of the season. The suffocating weight, my cold embrace on her spirit, the chill I had pressed into Rachel's bones for so many months, began to recede like a forgotten nightmare. The mortal paperwork was filed, their ink trying to capture the truths I had screamed in silence. Their investigations merely confirmed the ending I had already written. Logan and Martin were excised, phantoms banished from the manor's halls, cut from the tapestry of Henry's life, severing the last, fragile illusion to which his heart desperately clung. For the first time in an eternity, I felt her take a breath that wasn't laced with the bitter taste of my warnings. 1 week after the ghosts were captured, a voice from her past called, a tremor of relief in her father's tone, a sound I had not foreseen, a frequency of hope she hadn't heard from him in countless years. The debt, that cruel parasitic chain that had bound their family, that had fed my own strength, was finally, impossibly, broken, officially erased. The investigators, following the path I had illuminated, had traced the poison back to its source, the same dark well of finance from which Logan had drawn all his power. I saw the scheme, so carefully woven over months, begin its silent, inevitable collapse. The case opened like a wound, exposing the fraudulent network beneath the skin of civility. And just as I foresaw, the contract, built on lies, dissolved into nothingness. A path cleared. Rachel's mother could finally receive the care that was stolen from her. The true healing began again, the doctors adjusting their course, guided now by clarity. I saw the new prescriptions, the scheduled scans rituals to ward off the encroaching dark, and for the first time, the words they spoke about her future were not cloaked in shadow. A fragile optimism bloomed. I felt the change in the air, in the very rhythm of her breathing. It eased. The pain receded. The suffocating darkness that had clung to their home, that long night that had held their family captive, finally showed the first signs of dawn. I foresaw Rachel's tears the moment she heard the news. Not a storm of grief, but a quiet, exhausted rain that had been held back for too long. A cleansing. Miles away, within the stone walls of Lancaster Manor, another restoration was underway. I watched Henry's recovery unfold, not as a surprise, but as a slow, predetermined mend. Figures of healing would visit, their presence a steady drumbeat against the silence. 3 times a week, they would come, guiding him through the sacred motions of rebuilding. I saw the first agonizing attempts, the careful, measured exercises of a broken man. He could only manage a few steps, leaning on a metal frame like a penitent, then a few more. His lungs, once failing, began to draw strength from the air again. The machine that had been his anchor, the hiss of oxygen, began to fade into the background. It became a ghost in the room, a reminder of the edge he had been pulled back from, and his voice, once a whisper, started to reclaim its former resonance. A fragile firmness returned, but his eyes held the story. They carried the bruised tenderness of a soul learning to believe in solid ground again. He was rebuilding his faith in the world, one breath at a time. And Rachel was there. She stayed. And I knew it wasn't because of a debt that needed repaying. Not for gratitude, not for pity, not for any worldly obligation. No, something fundamental had been altered between them, a truth revealed. The night the world tried to end for him, it had instead created a beginning. In the ashes of that terror, a bond was forged, unseen by them, but clear as day to me. A fragile, unexpected truth had taken root in the ruins. She felt something genuine for him. It was there in the quiet way he held himself, the way he always remembered to ask about her parents, a small anchor to a world outside this one. I saw the soft humor flicker back to life in his eyes as his body healed, and I felt her admiration for the raw courage it took him to look into the abyss. of the betrayals that had been meticulously crafted to shatter his soul, and Lancaster Manor, the stone witness, began to heal with him. I watched Mary Lou fling open the windows, a defiant act against the gloom, inviting the clean, fresh wind to purge the lingering scent of despair. The heavy drapes, like funeral shrouds, were taken down and washed, the furniture shifted from its mournful positions, a silent rearranging of fate. I saw light pierce corners that had been surrendered to darkness for years. The very atmosphere of the house thinned, the oppressive weight lifting. It felt less like a tomb and more like a sanctuary. Each morning, Henry would trace the length of the hallways, his pilgrimage of recovery, leaning on the cane not for support, but as a scepter of his reclaimed will. The tremor in his hand was now just a memory. Rachel often walked as his silent guard, a quiet presence, matching her rhythm to the deliberate tap of his cane. Sometimes they would speak in low tones, other times the silence between them was a vow, and I witnessed the return of her smile. Not the hollow, polite gesture she once used as a shield, but something real that bloomed from within, a flicker of warmth against the cold. They were small, almost secret, but they held the weight of a true dawn. One evening, as the sun bled out across the lake's horizon, casting the ancient stone walls in a final glorious amber light, I saw Rachel standing at a tall window, a solitary figure framed in gold, watching Henry's determined, deliberate walk across the grounds. He carved a determined path through the garden's thickening shadows, with Mary Lou oblivious at his side. Every footfall was a drumbeat I could feel, measured and yet so terribly final. And she mistook his resolve for safety, feeling, I feel the shift, the very reason I came into being, a quiet anchor dropping in the sea of her soul. It isn't the thunder of victory I once foresaw, but a silence, deeply and truly human. No beast, no Matikino, was paraded as a trophy. No heavens opened with a roar of approval. No sweeping justice arrived to burn away the scars of the past. There was only this, the gentle hum of peace, the solid ground of safety, the first fragile color of dawn, a healing, real and profound. And for Rachel, the woman I was bound to, after she walked through the very fire my visions had promised, this quiet moment was worth more than any kingdom. My watch was finally over.